Hello, everyone. Welcome to part one of chapter six. In this chapter, we're going to be discussing osseous tissue and bone structure. So, as we get started, just reminding you that the dog that trots about finds a bone. All right. So, this is what our objectives are for this chapter. And we're going to really just get into it, kind of get started. The skeletal system, what does it contain? It has the bones of your skeleton, your cartilages, and your ligaments, and things like that. So we'll get into talk about that. What does it do? Well, support, storage, blood cell production, protection, and leverage. These are the big functions. Support, well, one of the big things that it does is support, is it provides support for your organs. For example, the bones of the skull support the organs, the ribs and sternum protect the heart and lungs. So it acts as a group of bones, or groups of bones can provide support for organs, support structures, things like that, as well as also provide protection, which we'll talk about that as well. It doesn't only support them and hold them in, but it also and gives them a home, but it also, we'll see that it also protects. We can store minerals and lipids. For example, calcium and phosphate are stored as in the bone, as well as fat in the form of yellow marrow. So we have the calcium and phosphate storage, those minerals, as well as lipids, fat. Red blood cells, white blood cells, most of your white blood cells, and other blood cell components like platelets and immune cells, they're made in the red bone marrow. We also protect soft tissues like our heart, lungs, and our brain, and we can act as leverage. How does it act as leverage? Well, the bones can be levers because muscles attach to the bone, the skeletal muscles attach to our bones to produce our movement. Now, the bones that we can have by shape, we got sutural bones. We sometimes call them warmer bones. They're bones found between the sutures of the skull. They're the irregular bones with their complex shapes. They're going to be such bones as, sorry, give me 1 second. I just got. So these are such bones as our vertebrae, our coxal bones, or sphenoid that we've seen in lab. Short bones, these are boxy bones. They're roughly equal dimensions, things like our carpal bones, our tarsal bones. Flat bones, very thin and flat, your parietals, your sternums, your ribs, your scapula, things like that. Our long bones are elongated. They have a shaft between two ends that are wide. Example will be your humerus, your femur, your radius, your tibia, all that. The sesamoid bones, they are small, flat, look like a sesame seed. So your patella. So we learned all these in lab. Okay. So here we can actually see examples of sutural bones. Here we have a warmer bone right here. For example, in between the parietal and occipital bone at the lambdoid suture. We have our flat bone, parietal bone, long bone, humerus, sesamoid bone, the patella, short bones, the carpal bones, and a vertebrae being an irregular bone in these diagrams here. Now, some things I do want to talk about is some bone markings and kind of basically give some very basic definitions for these. This will help for lab. There are elevations and projections. There's processes. These are projection or bump. A ramus, the plural is rami. These are extensions of a bone that form an angle with the rest of the bone. So like the ramus of the mandible, for example, the superior and inferior pubic ramus, the ischial ramus, those are the rami that we talked about. We have sinuses. These are chambers that are filled with air. We saw this as an example of the paranasal sinuses. A foramen is a rounded passageway for blood vessels and nerves. It is a hole. A fissure is a deep furrow, cleft, or slit. A meatus is an opening of a canal. And a canal is a duct or channel. So we saw these associated with different parts of the bones. We saw places where ligaments and tendons attach, trochanter or large and rough projections of the leg. It gets itself to run, a canter, run, canter. A crest is prominent ridge. A spine is a pointed process like the ischial spine, something like that. A tubercle, small rounded projection. We saw the greater and lesser tubercle. A tuberosity, a rough projection like the deltoid tuberosity, the tibial tuberosity, the radial tuberosity, those things like that. We saw a head. That's an articulation surface. The head is an expanded articular end of a bone, like the head of the humerus. A neck, which attaches the head to the bone. A facet is a small flat articular surface. A condyle is a smoother articular surface. And a trochlea is an articular process, a condyle that's basically shaped like a pulley. A depression could be a sulcus, a narrow groove, or a fossa, a shallow depression or pit. Okay. So those are some examples of some of these structures that I do want you guys to know what they basically just are. Really nothing too crazy about them, but what I want you guys to know about them. Okay. Now, we do want to talk about a long bone. The long bone, what I usually like to do when I do the long bone is just really quickly do a quick sketch of a long bone. Like it was a doggy bone, like a little dog treat, like some. Okay, so we have the diaphysis, we have the epiphysis, and the metaphysis. Okay, all right. So those are the structures that we have, okay, for a main bone. So our diaphysis is the long tubular shaft. It is hollow inside. The wall of it is made up of compact bone and is very solid. The inside of the bone called medullary cavity that may contain yellow marrow to store fat. The ends of the bones are called the epiphysis. The epiphysis is spongy bone with a thin layer of cortical bone, a compact bone on the outside. Spongy bone has red bone marrow in it, site of red blood cell production. Then between, and that's where your cortical bone is on the outside of that. And between the two is the metaphysis, attaching the epiphysis to the diaphysis is a narrow region called the metaphysis. All right, now flat bones are going to be like a sandwich of compact bone with spongy bone in between. The spongy bone, it's in between the two layers of compact bone called cortex. The two layers of compact bone is called cortex, and the middle is called dipole. Okay. The bone tissue is composed of cells and matrix, which is an important thing that we have on the composition of bone tissue. It's a connective tissue, so it's going to have a matrix. The matrix of bone is going to be dense deposits of calcium salts. So we're going to have calcium salts, which we'll talk about being hydroxyapatite. The matrix has cells in it called osteocytes, osteo meaning bone, site meaning cell. These are bone cells, and they're housed in the chambers that house them are called lacuna. The lacuna are surrounding by blood vessels in the matrix, and then connecting the blood vessels that are nearby is the canaliculi. The canaliculi go to allow the nutrients, wastes, and gases and things like that to be exchanged. Now, if you look at a bone, all over a bone except for the joints, there's a periosteum on the outside of the bone, and it has an outer fibrous layer and an inner cellular layer. So it's two layers. It has a tough outer fibrous layer and a soft inner cellular layer. Now, the bone matrix is made up of calcium salt, and which calcium phosphate makes up the bone matrix. What happens is this calcium phosphate reacts with a chemical called calcium hydroxide, and we make a crystalline structure called hydroxyapatite. This is the hardest material the body makes is hydroxyapatite. Then we add collagen fibers to this matrix to give flexibility because hydroxyapatite is very hard, but it's very brittle. So it is the hardest material we make. The highest level of hydroxyapatite we produce is our teeth. All right. Now, bone cells come in a progression. We have osteoprogenitor cells, sometimes called osteogenic. Now, when I learned them, I learned it as osteoprogenitor. So I always want to say osteoprogenitor first. But so an osteogenic or osteoprogenitor cell, we call these guys, they produce an osteoblast, and the osteoblast becomes an osteocyte. Now, an osteoblast builds bone. They ultimately give rise to osteocytes. The osteocyte is a mature osteoblast. So you can osteoprogenitor cell, osteoblast, osteocyte. Osteoclasts are derived from phagocytic cells, so they aren't derived from the osteoprogenitor, osteoblast, osteocyte. Osteocytes just maintain bone, and osteoclasts break down bone, and they're derived from phagocytes. Okay. Now, osteocytes are the mature bone cells. They occupy a lacuna. There's no more than one osteocyte per lacuna. The osteocytes have two functions. They maintain bone, they repair the damaged matrix. That's what they do. They maintain bone matrix and they repair any damaged matrix, like if you get a broken bone, for example, or fracture. Now, osteoblasts, these guys are going to be immature. The osteoblasts, they're going to produce new bone matrix. This process is called ossification or osteogenesis. If we look at a bone, one of the things we're going to see is its histology. Now, in its histology, we're going to see the basic functional unit called an osteon, sometimes called a Havartian system. The osteon, the functional unit, is going to allow for the bone to have the compactness to it. The osteon is arranged with osteocytes in lacuna, and they're in layers, concentric layers that are around the central canal. So they're around a central canal. The central canal has blood vessels in it. The other, the blood vessels, other blood vessels that go perpendicular to the surface, they're in perforating canals, which are also called Volkmann's canals. Now, I do sometimes use alternate names on tests, so be ready for that. But those are important because that's one of the ways that osteomyelitis can spread throughout bone. The concentric rings that the osteons are wrapped around in are called concentric lamellae, and they wrap around the central canal. The canaliculi, they go through the lamella, connecting the osteons of the lacuna with each other, so they allow the chemistry, the nutrients and gases and things to reach them. We have interstitial lamellae, which is between the osteons, and we have circumferential lamellae that wraps around the outer surface of the bone, and the circumferential lamellae is going to be covered in periosteum. So here you can see an osteon, and each ring with the lacuna holding osteocytes. Inside is the central canal. Here we can see our perforating canals going side by side to each osteon. Then we have our interstitial lamellae in between the osteons, and on the outside we have our circumferential lamellae. This creates the structure of a compact bone. All right, now spongy bone is not arranged, the lamellae aren't arranged in osteons. In fact, they're arranged in something called trabeculae. The trabeculae is how we arrange the osteons, the lamellae anyway, not osteons, but the lamellae. We arrange the lamellae in what is called trabeculae. The spongy bone is in the epiphysis. There is red bone marrow that forms red blood cells. Sometimes there is a little bit of yellow marrow that's also found here, okay? Spongy bone is really good at being stores red bone marrow for red blood cell production, but also it basically helps to reduce the weight of the bone and dissipate loads. So one of the things is it primarily is located where the stress is lower, and stresses come from many directions to dissipate the load. Like right here where the body weight applies directly to the top of the femur, it dissipates that load across the shaft and then dissipates that load across the knee, so that there's tension on one side and a compression force on the other side, okay? Okay. And then there is our periosteum. The periosteum is the most superficial covering. This covers the outside of bone, and it has two layers. There's an outer fibrous layer, an inner cellular layer. As I was talking about, it isolates your bone. It's from the surrounding tissues. It's going to give a way for blood vessels to get in and nerves to get in. It's going to be part of repair and growth and things like that for bone. To connect it to the bone itself, we use perforating fibers to attach the periosteum to the bone. We use those perforating fibers. And then lastly, I want to talk about the endosteum. And the endosteum is what we call an incomplete cellular layer because there's gaps. It's in the lining of the medullary cavity, very important in bone repair, bone growth, and remodeling. It covers the trabeculae of the spongy bone, and it's inside the central canals of compact bone. Osteoblasts and osteoclasts work together to add and remove bone tissue here. It's what we call bone remodeling. So it rebuilds bone there a lot. Bone is heavily adjusted here. Okay. All right, so we're going to stop here for our first lecture. This part is a little bit easier, so I just wanted to give you guys this easy part. Then we'll go into the conceptual part, okay? But this is the first half of the lecture, and this part's kind of easy. I've been trying to keep it to shorter, easier sections instead of going in one big video, okay?